For centuries, Ireland has carried an image of mystery, a green island at the far western edge of Europe, surrounded by the Atlantic, covered with ancient stone monuments, ruined castles, forgotten burial grounds, and landscapes that seem to preserve memories from another age. But beneath that visible history lies another story. A story written not in books, not on monuments, and not in the legends passed from one generation to another. It is written inside DNA. And when scientists began comparing the DNA of modern Irish people with genomes recovered from ancient remains, something became clear. The genetic history of Ireland is far more complicated than the simple story many people grew up hearing. For a long time, Ireland was imagined as a place where one ancient population remained relatively isolated for thousands of years. The idea sounds believable. Ireland is an island. The Atlantic surrounds it. Its western coastline appears almost impossibly distant from the heart of continental Europe. But geography does not mean genetic isolation. People crossed seas. They migrated. They brought families, animals, technologies, languages, and completely different genetic ancestry with them. And some of those migrations happened thousands of years before Ireland had anything resembling the society we would recognize today. To understand modern Irish DNA, scientists have had to travel much further back than the medieval period, much further back than the Vikings, even further back than the Celts. The story begins with some of the earliest human communities to reach the island. These people lived in a world that would be almost impossible to recognize today. There were no cities, no roads, no churches, no farms stretching across the landscape. Small groups of hunter-gatherers moved through forests and open landscapes, hunting animals, collecting plants, fishing rivers and coastal waters, and adapting to the changing environment around them. Their populations were small. Their communities were scattered, and for thousands of years, they represented one of the earliest genetic chapters of human settlement in Ireland. But then something changed. Agriculture arrived, and agriculture was not simply a new method of producing food. It changed almost everything. People could begin settling in one location for longer periods. They could cultivate crops. They could raise domesticated animals. Population sizes could increase. New villages could emerge. And most importantly for genetic history, new people began arriving. Across Europe, ancient DNA has revealed that the spread of farming was accompanied in many regions by major population movements. For decades, archaeologists debated whether early farmers were simply hunter-gatherers who adopted a new lifestyle, or whether farming communities migrated into Europe and mixed with, or sometimes largely replaced, earlier populations. Ancient DNA provided a powerful new way to investigate that question. And Ireland was not an exception. The genomes recovered from ancient Irish remains revealed that early farmers were genetically different from many of the hunter-gatherers who had lived on the island before them. That discovery changed the picture. Ireland's population history was already a story of movement. Already, thousands of years before written history, the island had experienced major demographic change. But the most dramatic transformation was still ahead. The Bronze Age. During the 3rd millennium BCE, populations carrying ancestry ultimately connected to the Eurasian steppe expanded across enormous parts of Europe. Their movement changed the genetic landscape of the continent. and Ireland appears to have experienced this transformation as well. Ancient individuals from Bronze Age Ireland carried substantial ancestry associated with these wider European population movements. This was not simply a cultural exchange, it left a genetic signature. And suddenly, the story of Ireland became much larger than Ireland itself. The people who contributed ancestry to prehistoric Ireland were connected to movements occurring across thousands of kilometers, from the Eurasian steppe to Central Europe, from Central Europe toward the Atlantic, and eventually into the far western edges of Europe. Ireland had not been sitting outside European history. It had been receiving the consequences of it. One of the remarkable examples comes from Rathlin Island, off the northern coast of Ireland. Ancient DNA from individuals associated with the early Bronze Age revealed ancestry that connected them to the broader steppe-related genetic transformation occurring across Europe. This matters because it challenges a common assumption. The people living in Ireland thousands of years ago were not necessarily descended from one isolated population that had remained unchanged since the first settlement of the island. Instead, different waves of people contributed to what eventually became the genetic population of Ireland. But there is an important detail. Population change does not always mean complete replacement. Sometimes newcomers arrive and mix with people already living there. Sometimes their numbers are large enough to dramatically change the genetic composition of a region. Sometimes earlier ancestry survives in smaller amounts. And sometimes populations that appear culturally different can still share substantial genetic continuity. This is why ancient DNA is so important. It allows scientists to look beyond names, beyond labels, beyond the identities people used thousands of years ago. Because a population can change its language without completely changing its DNA, a culture can spread without millions of people moving, and people can adopt new traditions while continuing to carry ancestry inherited from much older populations. This becomes particularly important when discussing the word Celtic. Modern discussions often treat Celtic identity as though it represents one ancient genetic population. But genetics does not support such a simple picture. There is no single DNA sequence that defines every Celtic person. Celtic languages and cultures developed and spread across different parts of Europe. The genetic history underneath those cultures is considerably older. Much of the ancestry found in modern Irish populations predates the period traditionally associated with Celtic culture by thousands of years. So, when scientists investigate Irish DNA, they are not searching for one magical Irish gene. They are reconstructing layers dot after layer. Ancient hunter-gatherer ancestry, early farming ancestry, Bronze Age ancestry, later Iron Age ancestry, and eventually genetic contributions associated with historical movements such as Viking and Norman settlement. Every period added another piece to the puzzle. And yet, modern Irish populations also retain significant genetic continuity with earlier populations of the British Isles. That combination is what makes the Irish genetic story so fascinating. It is neither a story of complete isolation nor a story of endless replacement. It is a story of continuity and transformation happening at the same time. Imagine the island thousands of years ago. There are no national borders, no modern political identities, no concept of Ireland as a country. There are only communities, families, settlements, travel routes, and the sea. The Atlantic may look like a barrier from the modern perspective, but to prehistoric people, the surrounding waters were not necessarily the end of the world. Boats could cross them, communities could maintain connections, people could move between Britain and Ireland, and over generations, those movements could reshape the genetic landscape. The Irish Sea, therefore, was not simply separating populations, it was connecting them. And this connection becomes even more interesting when scientists compare ancient genomes from Ireland with those from Britain and continental Europe. Parallels begin to emerge. Some ancestry appears to have arrived through Britain. Other ancestry can ultimately be traced to populations farther east. And some genetic signatures appear to have persisted locally for extremely long periods. The result is a population history that looks less like a straight line and more like a branching tree. But there is one period that stands out: the transition into the Bronze Age. This was a time of enormous technological and social change across Europe. Metalworking expanded, trade networks grew, new burial practices appeared, weapons became important symbols of status, and populations moved over long distances. Ireland became part of these wider networks. And the genetic evidence suggests that the demographic changes were substantial. This is where one of the basic misconceptions about Irish ancestry begins to collapse. The idea that modern Irish DNA is simply the unchanged DNA of the island's earliest inhabitants cannot explain the evidence. The population had already changed multiple times before recorded history, and yet something remarkable survived through all those transformations: continuity. Not perfect continuity, not complete genetic isolation, but enough continuity that modern populations still carry recognizable traces of ancient ancestry. That is the paradox at the heart of Irish genetics. The population changed, but it also persisted. New people arrived, but older ancestry did not necessarily disappear. And the genetic identity of modern Ireland emerged from this complicated mixture. If you're enjoying this journey into the hidden origins of Irish DNA, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because the deeper scientists go into Ireland's ancient genetic record, the more surprising the story becomes. And the next discoveries take us into a period when a major population transformation appears to have reshaped the island. And that transformation raises an even bigger question. If the people of Bronze Age Ireland carried ancestry connected to populations thousands of kilometers away, where exactly did those people come from? And how did their descendants eventually become part of the population that would, many centuries later, be recognized as Irish? The answer takes us away from the green hills of Ireland, back toward the Eurasian steppe, back toward a world of mobile pastoral communities, horses, wagons, and enormous migrations, because the genetic ancestry that appeared in Ireland during the Bronze Age was not an isolated Irish phenomenon. It was part of one of the largest demographic transformations ever detected in ancient European DNA. And Ireland was at the western edge of it. The people carrying this ancestry had traveled an extraordinary distance. Their genetic journey had crossed landscapes, rivers, mountains, and eventually seas. By the time their descendants appeared in Ireland, they were thousands of kilometers from the regions where this ancestry had first developed, and yet their DNA survived. It survived in ancient bones. It survived through generations of families, and eventually, fragments of that ancient genetic history became part of the ancestry carried by people living in Ireland today. But genetics alone cannot tell the entire story. Because DNA can reveal that people moved, it cannot always tell us exactly why. Were they searching for new land? Were they escaping conflict? Were they following trade routes? Were communities expanding because of population growth? Or were several forces acting together? Scientists can identify the genetic footprints. Archaeologists can examine tools, settlements, graves, and artifacts, and historians can reconstruct later written records. When these different forms of evidence are combined, a much richer picture begins to emerge. Ireland's genetic history was never simply about one people. It was about movement, connection, adaptation, and survival. And perhaps that is the most fascinating discovery of all, because modern Irish DNA does not represent a single moment in history. It represents thousands of years of human decisions. Every migration left a trace. Every family that crossed the sea carried something forward. Every generation inherited a fragment of the past, and somewhere inside modern Irish genomes are echoes of people who lived long before the names Ireland, Celtic, Viking, or Norman ever existed. But the story does not end with the Bronze Age. The next chapters would bring new migrations, new cultural identities, new connections with Britain and continental Europe, and eventually, people whose arrival would become some of the most famous episodes in Irish history. The Vikings would come, the Normans would come, kingdoms would rise, languages would change, and populations would continue to mix. Yet beneath all of it, the older genetic layers would remain, waiting to be discovered. And when scientists finally began reading those layers, they found something that no medieval chronicle could have revealed. The history of Ireland had been written inside its people all along. The Bronze Age had transformed the genetic landscape of Ireland, but the island's story was far from finished. Thousands of years would pass before anyone could look back and understand what had happened. For the people living through those changes, there was no concept of genetics. There were only families, communities, territories, alliances, rivalries, migrations, and generations. And one of the most important things ancient DNA has revealed is that these populations were not living in complete isolation. Ireland was connected to Britain. Britain was connected to continental Europe, and continental Europe was connected to enormous networks stretching far beyond the Atlantic coast. This means that the genetic history of Ireland cannot be understood by looking at Ireland alone. It has to be placed inside the much larger story of European population movement. After the Bronze Age, Ireland entered a period in which new cultural identities emerged across Western Europe. Iron technology spread, trade networks expanded, political structures became more complex, and communities became increasingly connected. Eventually, traditions associated with Celtic languages and cultures became prominent across parts of Europe. But once again, genetics complicates the popular story. The people who spoke Celtic languages were not necessarily descended from one genetically uniform population. Culture and ancestry are not the same thing. A language can spread from one community to another. A technology can spread without mass migrations. A religion can spread across populations. And an identity can become powerful enough that people adopt it even when their ancestors came from very different backgrounds. This is why scientists are careful when discussing Celtic DNA. There is no single genetic profile that can simply be labeled Celtic. Instead, modern Irish ancestry contains older genetic layers that existed long before Celtic languages appeared. That distinction is easy to overlook, but it completely changes the way the story should be understood. The ancestors of modern Irish people were not created in one historical moment. Their genetic history was accumulated over thousands of years. And then came another famous chapter. The Vikings, beginning in the late 8th century, Scandinavian raiders and settlers began appearing across Ireland and the wider British Isles. Their arrival is recorded in medieval sources. Monasteries were attacked. Coastal settlements became targets. Trading networks expanded. And eventually, Scandinavian communities established themselves in Ireland. Dublin became one of the most important Viking settlements in the region. But what did the Vikings actually contribute to Irish DNA? This is where genetics again provides a more complicated picture than the historical imagination. The Viking Age involved movement in multiple directions. Scandinavians did not simply arrive in Ireland and replace the existing population. They interacted with local communities. They settled, they traded, they married. They had children, and over generations, Scandinavian ancestry became incorporated into parts of the population. Ancient DNA from Viking-era individuals across the British Isles has helped researchers understand how complex these movements were. Some individuals associated with Viking culture carried ancestry that was not purely Scandinavian. They could have mixed ancestry themselves. This is a reminder that even the people we call Vikings were not a genetically uniform population. The word Viking describes a cultural and social phenomenon, not a single biological group. Some people came from Norway, some from Denmark, some from other parts of Scandinavia, and the communities they encountered were already genetically diverse. So when Scandinavian ancestry entered Ireland, it became another layer in an already complicated population history. Then another major transformation arrived: the Norman invasion. In the 12th century, Norman forces and their allies entered Ireland, creating new political structures and settlements. Again, the genetic impact was not simply a matter of one population replacing another. Some newcomers settled permanently, others did not. Some families became deeply integrated into Irish society. Over generations, cultural boundaries became increasingly complicated. A person could have Norman ancestry and become culturally Irish. A family could adopt the Irish language. Another could maintain connections with England or Wales. Genetic ancestry did not always follow political identity, and this is one of the central lessons of Irish population genetics. Identity is dynamic. DNA is inherited. But culture can change within a single generation. This becomes especially important when scientists examine modern Irish populations. When researchers compare Irish genomes with populations across Europe, they find that Irish people share much of their ancestry with neighboring populations of northwestern Europe. That is not surprising. Geography matters. Migration matters. Shared ancient ancestry matters. But there are also genetic patterns that help distinguish populations within the British Isles. Certain regions of Ireland show stronger genetic differentiation than others. This is partly the result of historical population structure and relative isolation. For centuries, many communities were organized around local territories and extended family networks. People often married within relatively nearby communities. In rural areas, geographical barriers could limit movement. Mountains, rivers, coastlines, and political boundaries all played roles. Over generations, these patterns could allow particular genetic variants to become more common in certain regions. This is one reason scientists can sometimes detect regional genetic structure even within a relatively small island. Northern Ireland provides another fascinating example because of its historical connections with Scotland and Britain. Population movements across the Irish Sea occurred for centuries. People moved for trade, for war, for agriculture, for political reasons, and later, through organized settlement. These movements created genetic connections that do not fit neatly inside modern national borders. The DNA does not recognize the borders drawn on modern maps. A chromosome inherited from an ancestor does not know whether that ancestor lived in Ireland, Scotland, England, or somewhere else. It simply carries the genetic information forward. And this is why population genetics can sometimes reveal historical connections that written records only partially describe. But there is another side to the story. Some genetic variants found at unusually high frequencies in Ireland are connected to population history and genetic drift. When populations remain relatively small or geographically concentrated, certain inherited variants can become more common simply by chance. One famous example involves the genetic condition hereditary hemochromatosis. A particular variant in the HFE gene, especially the C282Y variant, is found at relatively high frequency among people of Northern European ancestry, including populations with Irish ancestry. This does not mean that Irish people have a special gene. It means that historical population structure and genetic inheritance can influence how common certain variants become in particular populations. The reasons are still studied, and scientists have proposed several explanations for why some variants reached high frequencies. Natural selection has been investigated. Population bottlenecks have been considered. Founder effects and genetic drift are also important possibilities, but this is precisely where scientific caution matters. The presence of a genetic variant in a population does not automatically tell us why it became common. Genetics can show the pattern. Understanding the cause requires much more evidence, and that principle applies to Irish ancestry as a whole. A DNA result can tell someone that they have ancestry connected to a particular population. But ancestry percentages should never be interpreted as exact measurements of cultural identity. DNA does not determine whether someone is Irish. A person can have deep Irish cultural identity with relatively little detectable Irish-specific ancestry. Another person can have substantial Irish ancestry without identifying culturally as Irish. These are different concepts. Genetic ancestry is about inheritance. Identity is about people. History is about both. And Ireland's history demonstrates just how complicated those relationships can become. Modern genetic studies have also revealed that populations in Ireland are not perfectly homogeneous. Regional differences exist. The genetic structure of Western Ireland can differ in subtle ways from that of Eastern regions. Northern populations can show different patterns from southern populations. These differences are usually small, compared with the differences between Europeans and populations from distant parts of the world, but at a fine scale, they can still be detected. Why? Because people did not move randomly across the island for thousands of years. Families stayed in particular areas. Communities grew locally. Some regions experienced more migration than others. Historical events affected different regions in different ways, and every generation carried those patterns forward. The result is a genetic landscape that resembles a mosaic, not a single uniform Irish genome, a mosaic, different regions, different ancestry proportions, different historical influences, but overlapping deeply with one another. And this is where modern technology has changed everything. For most of history, scientists could only study ancestry indirectly. They had archaeological remains, historical documents, language, artifacts, burial practices. But DNA offered something completely different. It allowed researchers to examine the biological relationships between people separated by hundreds or even thousands of years. Ancient DNA extracted from bones and teeth could be compared with genomes from living populations. Suddenly, the past could be tested against the present. A skeleton buried thousands of years ago was no longer simply an archaeological object. It could contain genetic information about ancestry, population movement, family relationships, and sometimes even evidence of disease. But ancient DNA is difficult to recover. DNA breaks down over time. Temperature matters, moisture matters, soil chemistry matters, and Ireland's relatively wet climate can make preservation challenging. Yet, researchers have still managed to recover valuable genomes from ancient Irish remains. Every successful sample becomes another piece of the puzzle. And the more samples scientists collect, the clearer the larger pattern becomes. Ireland was never genetically frozen, but it was never completely replaced either. Instead, the island experienced waves of demographic change, followed by long periods of local continuity. That pattern helps explain why modern Irish people can simultaneously carry ancestry connected to ancient European populations, while also showing strong genetic relationships with neighboring populations. The Irish genetic story is therefore not about finding one original ancestor. It is about understanding the accumulation of ancestry. Think of DNA as an archive. Not a perfect archive, not a written history, but an archive nonetheless. Some pages are missing. Some sections have been overwritten by later generations. Some signals become weaker with time, but enough remains to reconstruct parts of the story. And when scientists examine the Irish genetic archive, they see evidence of people who lived during periods separated by thousands of years. Hunter-gatherers, early farmers, Bronze Age populations, Iron Age communities, Viking-era settlers, Norman-era migrants, and the countless generations that followed. Each one contributed something. Some ancestry became widespread, some became rare, some disappeared almost completely, and some genetic lines survived against enormous odds. This is particularly striking when we think about the sheer number of ancestors each person has. Every generation doubles the theoretical number of ancestors. Go back 10 generations, and the number becomes enormous. Go back hundreds of generations, and the family tree becomes almost impossible to visualize. Of course, the same ancestors appear repeatedly because distant relatives married within overlapping populations. This creates what geneticists call pedigree collapse. The family tree folds back on itself. And that means modern populations are connected in ways that are far more complicated than a simple family tree suggests. A person living in Ireland today may carry tiny fragments of ancestry from many different ancient populations. Most of those ancestors have no surviving written name, no monument, no known grave, yet their DNA may still exist. That is perhaps the most powerful part of ancient genetic research. History usually remembers the powerful, kings, warriors, leaders, explorers, but DNA can preserve traces of ordinary people, farmers, fishermen, hunters, mothers, children, families who lived thousands of years ago and disappeared from written history. Their names are gone. Their languages may be gone. Their settlements may have vanished. But fragments of their genetic legacy can remain. And Ireland provides an extraordinary window into that process, because the island's population history contains both isolation and connection. Its geography created opportunities for local genetic structure. Its position within the Atlantic world allowed repeated contact with Britain and continental Europe, and its history produced waves of migration without completely erasing what came before. This is why the idea of a single Irish genetic origin is ultimately too simple. There was no single beginning. There were beginnings, many of them, and each one contributed to the population that eventually emerged. But there is still one major question. If so many populations contributed to Irish ancestry, why does modern Irish DNA appear relatively distinctive when compared with many other European populations? What forces created that pattern? Why did some ancient genetic signals survive while others became much weaker? And how much of the modern Irish genetic profile can actually be traced back to the prehistoric population movements scientists have discovered? The answers are hidden inside the smallest details of the genome, tiny variations. Shared mutations, segments of DNA inherited from distant ancestors. And patterns that only become visible when thousands of genomes are compared. The closer researchers look, the more Ireland begins to resemble something very different from the isolated island of popular imagination. It becomes a crossroads at the western edge of Europe. And the final part of the story takes us into the modern genetic map of Ireland, where scientists can begin connecting these ancient migrations to the people living on the island today. Because after thousands of years of migration, mixing, isolation, and survival, one question remains above all others. How much of ancient Ireland is still alive in Irish DNA today? The answer begins with something that sounds simple, but becomes more fascinating the deeper scientists look. Modern Irish DNA is not the DNA of one ancient population. It is a genetic record built over thousands of years, and when researchers compare modern Irish genomes with ancient DNA from Ireland and surrounding regions, they can see traces of several major population movements that shaped the island long before modern Ireland existed. The first people left a genetic legacy. Early farmers added another. Bronze Age migrations transformed the population again. Later movements from Britain and Scandinavia contributed additional ancestry. And through all of this, older genetic signals survived. That survival is important because it tells us that population change does not always erase what came before. Sometimes history behaves more like layers of sediment. A new layer forms on top of an older one. Another layer arrives centuries later. And beneath the surface, parts of the earlier world remain. Modern Irish DNA contains some of those layers, but scientists have also discovered something else. The genetic structure of Ireland is not completely uniform. There are regional patterns. People from different parts of the island can show subtle genetic differences, reflecting centuries of geography, migration, marriage patterns, and population history. These differences are not enormous. Ireland is not divided into completely separate genetic populations. Instead, the genetic landscape changes gradually. Western regions can carry different historical signals from eastern regions. Northern populations have connections reflecting centuries of movement across the Irish Sea. Southern and central regions contain their own mixtures of ancient and more recent ancestry. And this is exactly what scientists would expect from a population that experienced both migration and periods of relative isolation. The island's geography helped preserve local patterns, but the surrounding seas never completely stopped people from moving. And this creates one of the most interesting features of Irish genetic history. Ireland was isolated enough for certain genetic patterns to become distinctive, but connected enough for new ancestry to arrive repeatedly. That balance shaped the population. It also explains why genetic scientists can sometimes distinguish people with Irish ancestry from other populations of northwestern Europe using patterns across the genome. But there is an important warning. There is no single Irish gene. There is no single DNA sequence that proves someone is Irish. Genetic ancestry works through thousands or millions of tiny variations inherited across generations. Some are common across large parts of Europe. Some are more frequent in particular regions, and some can become unusually common because of historical population structure. This is why ancestry is best understood as a probability, based on patterns rather than a simple label. A DNA test may estimate that someone has ancestry associated with Ireland or the broader British Isles, but that percentage is not a measurement of cultural identity. It is an estimate of genetic similarity, and the deeper scientists investigate, the more these distinctions matter. Because the modern Irish population itself has never been completely isolated, historical migrations continued long after the Viking Age. People moved between Ireland and Britain. They moved to continental Europe. They left Ireland for North America, Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the world. And eventually, millions of descendants of Irish emigrants lived far beyond the island. This created another fascinating genetic story. The history of Irish DNA is no longer contained within Ireland. It traveled during the 19th century, especially during and after the Great Famine. Enormous numbers of people left Ireland. They crossed the Atlantic. They settled in cities and rural communities. They formed families, and their descendants became part of populations around the world. Today, Irish ancestry can be found across North America, Australia, Britain, and many other regions. But the DNA of those descendants can also preserve clues about the populations from which their ancestors came. This means that Irish genetic history can sometimes be studied far beyond the borders of Ireland itself. But there is another reason Ireland has become particularly important to genetic research. Its relatively well-documented population history provides an opportunity to compare genetics with historical records. Researchers can examine ancient DNA. They can compare it with modern genomes. They can study archaeological evidence, and they can use historical documents to understand later migration. When all these sources point in the same direction, confidence increases, and sometimes the genetic evidence reveals a story that written history could never have shown. For example, a historical document might record that a group arrived somewhere, but DNA can reveal whether those people actually contributed substantially to the later population. A settlement may have existed for centuries, but its genetic influence could have been surprisingly limited. Conversely, a migration that received relatively little attention in historical records may leave a significant genetic signal. This is one reason ancient DNA has changed population history so dramatically. It gives scientists a second record, a biological record. And Ireland is one of the places where those two records can be compared in extraordinary detail. But perhaps the most important discovery is not about Vikings. It is not about Celts. It is not even about Bronze Age migrations. It is about continuity, because despite all the migrations that shaped Ireland, modern Irish populations still preserve ancestry connected to people who lived on the island thousands of years ago. The exact proportions vary depending on the population and the populaced and the model used, but the broader pattern is clear. The past was not completely erased. It survived. Some of it survived in recognizable genetic signals. Some survived only as small fragments, and some ancient lineages may have disappeared entirely. That is normal. Genetic history is full of dead ends. A person can have thousands of ancestors, but leave no descendants today. A family line can disappear within a few generations. Another lineage can expand dramatically and become common throughout a region. Population genetics is therefore not simply about discovering where people came from. It is also about discovering which ancestral lines survived. This introduces the concept of genetic drift. Imagine a small population. A few families have children. By chance, certain genetic variants become common among their descendants. Other variants disappear. No advantage is required. No special biological reason. Sometimes chance alone can reshape the genetic composition of a population over generations. This process can be especially powerful in populations that experience historical bottlenecks, and Ireland experienced several periods of demographic crisis. Wars, famine, disease, migration, economic collapse. These events changed population size and structure. The Great Famine was particularly devastating. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland experienced catastrophic mortality and mass emigration. The population declined dramatically. Millions of people eventually left the island over the decades that followed. Such demographic events can influence genetic diversity and the distribution of ancestry. But even before the 19th century, Ireland had experienced population fluctuations, and every major demographic event left another layer in the genetic record. This is why modern Irish DNA cannot be separated from history. Genes are biological, but populations are historical, and history determines which genetic lineages survive. There is also a fascinating relationship between Irish genetics and disease. Scientists have investigated whether certain genetic variants became common because of historical environmental pressures. One famous area of research concerns variants involved in iron metabolism, including changes in the HFE gene. Ireland has relatively high frequencies of certain variants associated with hereditary hemochromatosis. Researchers have proposed different explanations for how these variants became so common. Some theories involve historical diets and iron availability. Others emphasize population history and genetic drift. But the exact evolutionary story is complex, and this illustrates an important point. A genetic pattern can be real, even when scientists are still debating why it exists. Science does not require every question to have an immediate answer. Sometimes the discovery comes first, the explanation comes later, and Irish genetics still contains many unanswered questions. For example, scientists continue to investigate the exact demographic processes behind the dramatic genetic changes of prehistoric Ireland. How large were the incoming populations? How much local ancestry survived? Were changes concentrated in particular regions? How quickly did populations mix? What happened to the hunter-gatherer communities? And how did later cultural changes interact with the genetic landscape? Every new ancient genome can change the picture. A single skeleton can sometimes reveal a previously unknown connection. A group of individuals can reveal a migration pattern. And hundreds of genomes can transform an entire historical model. This is why the field is moving so quickly. The technology is improving. DNA extraction methods are becoming more efficient. Sequencing is becoming more powerful. Statistical models are becoming more sophisticated, and researchers can compare enormous numbers of genomes simultaneously. The result is a new kind of historical investigation, one where bones become data, and data becomes a map of human movement. Ireland is particularly fascinating because it sits at the far western end of the European genetic landscape. It was not the starting point of every migration, but it was often one of the final destinations. Populations moved westward across Europe. Some reached Britain, some reached Ireland, and their descendants remained there. This means modern Irish DNA contains traces of movements that began far beyond the island. Some of those movements began thousands of years ago. Others happened much more recently. And yet they are all compressed into the genomes of living people. That is the extraordinary thing about DNA. A genome is not a history book with dates and names. It is more like a compressed archive. Millions of pieces of information inherited from ancestors. Some pieces are shared with close relatives, some with distant populations, some with people who lived thousands of years ago. And some variations may be unique to a particular family line. When scientists compare enough genomes, they can begin reconstructing relationships. They can estimate when populations separated. They can identify periods of mixing. They can detect ancestry that would otherwise be invisible. And sometimes they can see connections that history forgot. But there is one final misconception worth destroying. Irish genetic history does not prove that modern Irish people are pure descendants of one ancient population. No major European population is. Purity is not how human population history works. Every population is the product of movement and mixing. The genetic story of Ireland simply makes that reality unusually visible. The island's population carries ancient ancestry from multiple periods. Some components are extremely old. Others arrived later. And modern Irish identity emerged from centuries of cultural and historical development layered over this genetic foundation. So when someone looks at an Irish person today, they are not looking at a frozen image of ancient Ireland. They are looking at the latest chapter of an extraordinarily long story. A story that began with the first humans who reached the island, continued through hunter-gatherers and farmers, was transformed during the Bronze Age, was reshaped by later migrations, survived political upheavals, survived famine, survived mass emigration, and continues today. Perhaps the most powerful realization is that none of those ancient people knew what their descendants would become. A farmer buried thousands of years ago could never have imagined modern Dublin. A Bronze Age family could never have imagined the Irish diaspora. A Viking settler could never have imagined that fragments of their ancestry might still exist in people living centuries later, and yet their biological legacy continued. Generation after generation, he inside ordinary people. This is why Irish genetics is not simply a story about DNA. It is a story about survival. Every person alive today is the endpoint of an unbroken chain of births stretching deep into the past. Break that chain at any point, and the person standing here today would not exist. One ancestor makes a difference. One surviving family line makes a difference. One migration can alter the future of an entire population, and Ireland is an extraordinary example of this principle. Its genetic history shows that populations can change dramatically while still retaining traces of what came before. It shows that islands can be isolated without being disconnected. It shows that culture and genetics can tell different stories. And perhaps, most importantly, it shows that the past is not as distant as it feels. Some of it is still alive, not in legends, not in monuments, but in DNA. The ancient hunter-gatherers are part of the story. The early farmers are part of the story. The Bronze Age migrants are part of the story. The later populations who crossed the Irish Sea are part of the story. The Vikings are part of the story. The Normans are part of the story. And the countless unnamed families who lived between those famous moments are part of the story too. Together, they created the genetic landscape of Ireland. So the next time Ireland is described as an ancient, isolated island, the genetic evidence tells us to look again. Because beneath the green fields and stone walls is a record of movement on a continental scale. People came, people stayed, people mixed, people disappeared, and people survived. Their DNA crossed thousands of years to reach the present, and that is perhaps the greatest mystery of Irish genetics. The most ancient parts of the story are not truly gone. They are still here, carried quietly from generation to generation inside the people of Ireland, and in the descendants of Ireland scattered across the world. The island may sit at the western edge of Europe, but genetically its story reaches far beyond its shores. It reaches backward into prehistoric Europe, across the Atlantic world, toward Britain, toward Scandinavia, and even farther east, toward the ancient populations whose migrations transformed the genetic landscape of an entire continent. The Irish story was never one straight line. It was a web. Thousands of lives connected across thousands of years. And modern Irish DNA is what remains when all those paths finally meet. That is the real story, hidden inside Irish genetics. Not one bloodline, not one ancient race, not one mysterious origin, but thousands of years of human movement, survival, mixing, and continuity, a history written so deeply into the genome that even after kingdoms disappeared, languages changed, borders moved, and generations passed into history, the DNA remembered.